June 22nd, 1941. Just past dawn, the pale light of a summer morning stretched over the fields near Brest on the western edge of the Soviet Union. Dew clung to the blades of grass, glistening like tiny sparks under the weak sun. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, carried faintly over the quiet countryside, but it did little to mask the sudden, thunderous roar of engines. The Luftwaffe had arrived. Lieutenant Ivan Petrovich, a junior officer in the Red Army, stationed near the frontier, felt the ground tremble beneath his boots. "Air raid," shouted a sentry, the alarm slicing through the crisp morning air. Soldiers scrambled, dragging anti-aircraft guns into position, while the first German Stukas dived, shrieking overhead. Explosions erupted across rail yards and storage depots. The smell of burning oil and scorched timber filled the air overhead. The sky was a seething mass of aircraft, silver birds of death streaking across the horizon. Petrovich ducked into a trench as a salvo struck the nearby munitions depot. Smoke and flame mingled with the cries of men and the whine of shrapnel. He knew the reports. Hundreds of thousands of German troops were advancing, and the border defenses were crumbling under Blitzkrieg's relentless assault. At the far edge of the city, Stalin's government received the news with grim efficiency. Across the Soviet Union, industrial centers braced for the worst. Factories that had churned out everything from T-34 tanks to Marcin Nagant rifles were suddenly in the line of fire, vulnerable to the rapid German advance. The enemy's intent was clear: destroy the heart of Soviet production, and with it, the Red Army's ability to resist. Yet, somewhere deep within the Kremlin, a different plan was already taking shape. Stalin's ministers and industrial chiefs convened under heavy security. Maps spread across the table like a battlefield itself. "We cannot allow our factories to fall," growled one deputy, his finger stabbing a route eastward across the Ural mountains. "Every machine, every worker, every blueprint, we move it all. There is no other choice." Across the Western Soviet territories, the ordinary workers, engineers, machinists, and assembly crews received orders that seemed almost impossible. Packing an entire factory, from conveyor belts to tiny precision tools, and loading it onto freight trains that snaked eastward over thousands of miles of rail. Impossible. And yet, as smoke rose from the first towns bombed by German planes, the first convoys began to roll. The contrast was stark. On one side, the German generals, confident in their rapid advance and overwhelming air superiority, assumed victory was near. They believed the Soviet industrial machine would collapse under the pressure, that once Moscow fell, the factories would be lost forever. On the other side, a determined, methodical evacuation was underway. Silent trains snaking under cover of night, moving the lifeblood of Soviet industry beyond the reach of the Wehrmacht. By mid-morning, in a small rail yard near Smolensk, engineer Sergei Ivanovich oversaw the loading of the first T-34 chassis onto flat cars. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with the grime of oil and soot. "Faster," he barked, though the men were already straining with all their strength. Sparks flew as machinery was dismantled, wires disconnected, and engines hoisted onto rail platforms. Every crate, every rivet, was a tiny act of defiance against the seemingly unstoppable German tide. From a vantage point atop a nearby hill, German scouts observed the commotion. Colonel Friedrich von Strachwitz, a seasoned commander, squinted through his binoculars at the frenzied activity. "They are fleeing," he muttered to his aide, assuming panic. "Soon, they will have nothing left to fight with."
Their factories will be rubble by the time we reach them. He did not yet comprehend the scale of what was happening. What the scouts saw as retreat was in reality a meticulously organized evacuation, an industrial ballet that would soon confound every assumption the Wehrmacht had about Soviet capability. By nightfall, the first long trains began their journey beyond the Urals. Headlights pierced the darkness, rails groaning under the immense weight of machinery and armored vehicles. Inside the wagons, workers caught brief moments of sleep amid the rattle and clang, their minds racing with calculations, schematics, and fear for the future. The smell of coal smoke mixed with oil and iron, a tangible proof of human resilience. Every mile carried them farther from the front, and yet closer to the hope that the Soviet Union might rise again from the ashes. And so began a campaign within a campaign, a race against time. Stalin's industrial exodus was about to transform the war in ways the German High Command could scarcely imagine. What appeared at first as a retreat was, in truth, the beginning of an extraordinary strategic miracle, one that would leave Hitler's generals shaking their heads in disbelief for years to come. Type continued to generate the next section.
Section 2. The Great Migration of Industry. Eastward beyond the Urals. July 1941. Somewhere in the vast expanse of the Russian heartland, past the dense forests and winding rivers, the first convoy of factory trains crawled eastward. Locomotives strained under unprecedented loads, entire machine shops, assembly lines, boilers and crates brimming with raw steel. Each car carried not just machinery, but the knowledge, skill, and lifeblood of Soviet industry. Major General Dmitry Medvedev, head of the logistical corps, assigned to oversee the relocation, rode in a small armored rail car at the head of one convoy. He peered out the narrow window, eyes scanning the endless horizon of birch trees and marshlands. Maintain speed, he barked over the clamor of steel wheels on rails. Every hour counts. If the Germans intercept even one convoy, the loss will be catastrophic. Inside the train cars, engineers and workers moved like a single organism. Conveyor belts were reassembled on the tracks, lathes reconnected, and furnaces carefully leveled. Sparks flew from welding torches, illuminating faces streaked with soot and determination. There was no room for error. A misaligned shaft, a dropped blueprint, or a damaged engine could set production back weeks. Every man, from the youngest apprentice to the seasoned master machinist, understood the stakes. This was not just survival. It was a fight for the very future of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, German intelligence watched in frustration. Reports filtered back to the High Command. Entire industrial complexes had vanished from the Western territories. Colonel Heinz Weber, tasked with assessing Soviet production capabilities, scribbled furiously in his notebook. "Impossible," he muttered, shaking his head. "They have moved factories beyond reach, factories that were here just days ago. How can a nation accomplish this?" His superiors dismissed it at first as exaggeration or miscommunication. But as the weeks passed, the truth became undeniable. The Soviets were performing an industrial miracle under fire. The scope of the operation was staggering. Over 1,500 factories, ranging from tank assembly plants to small munitions workshops, were uprooted and transported across thousands of miles. Rail networks that had previously carried coal and timber were repurposed for a massive migration. Bridges and tunnels became arteries of survival. Even in the most remote regions east of the Urals, local populations were mobilized to assist, constructing temporary sheds, workshops, and shelters for the incoming machinery. Entire towns transformed almost overnight into hubs of industrial activity. In Chelyabinsk, a city that would later earn the nickname Tankergrad, workers toiled day and night to reassemble dismantled factories. Lieutenant Anna Sokolova,
supervising the installation of new presses and assembly lines, shouted over the din. "Faster, the front is advancing, but we cannot stop now. Every tank that rolls off these lines will save lives." The rhythmic clanging of hammers, the hiss of steam, and the roar of engines formed a symphony of wartime resilience, echoing across the snowless plain. Despite the chaos, morale remained high. Workers understood the symbolic importance of their labor. Each rivet tightened, each part fitted, was a declaration of defiance. Families lived beside the factories, sharing meals in makeshift canteens, and sleeping in converted storage halls. Children delivered messages and carried tools, while engineers pored over blueprints by kerosene lamp, ensuring every machine would function perfectly when production resumed. By mid-August, the first T-34 tanks, freshly assembled from relocated components, rumbled onto test tracks in the Urals. Officers inspected them meticulously, noting precision welds, smooth turret rotation, and reliable engines. "They are back," whispered Colonel Ivan Orlov, observing the scene. "The Soviets are producing again, faster than we ever anticipated." Word of these successes traveled west, reaching German officers who could scarcely comprehend it. Intelligence reports, that once dismissed as rumor, now painted a grim picture. The Soviet war machine was not defeated. It had simply moved, regrouped, and was preparing to strike again. Even as Hitler's generals plotted further advances into Soviet territory, the logistical marvel continued unabated. Rail cars shuttled across the endless expanses, bridges were reinforced, and temporary factories sprang up in the shadow of the Urals' rugged peaks. Engineers developed clever solutions to challenges no peacetime industrialist could imagine. Improvised cranes lifted multi-ton engines, makeshift power lines electrified assembly lines, and entire communities coordinated with military precision to ensure no machine or worker was left behind. By autumn, a new industrial landscape had emerged, hidden deep in the east. It was a testament to planning, ingenuity, and sheer will. The German military could advance hundreds of kilometers, flatten cities and occupy territories, but they could not erase the relentless shifting engine of Soviet production. And in this quiet, often overlooked part of the war, the seeds of eventual Soviet resurgence were already being sown.
Section 3. Hitler's shock. German intelligence stumbles. October 1941. High above the Eastern Front, in a command tent near Smolensk, German General Heinz Guderian pored over fresh intelligence reports, the lines on the map seemingly shifting beneath his gaze. Tank battalions had advanced deep into Soviet territory, capturing industrial towns and supply depots, yet the flow of Soviet tanks, guns, and ammunition seemed undiminished. It defied every expectation. "Tell me again," Guderian barked at his aide, his voice tinged with disbelief. "How are they still producing T-34s? His aide shuffled papers nervously. "Sir, reconnaissance confirms. New production, east of the Urals. Entire factories were dismantled and moved beyond the reach of our forces." The generals exchanged uneasy glances. It was one thing to anticipate resistance, another entirely to witness an enemy whose industry seemed immune to destruction. Colonel Wilhelm Richter, a veteran of the OKH Intelligence Division, leafed through photographs of massive new industrial complexes, smoke rising from chimneys, long lines of tanks and trucks waiting for assembly, men and women laboring with uncanny efficiency. They moved entire factories," Richter murmured, "beyond the Urals, hundreds of kilometers. Impossible." Meanwhile, Hitler sat in his headquarters at the Wolfschanze, flanked by advisors and generals. The news was delivered with clinical precision, yet the reaction was anything but calm. "How?" he demanded, slamming a fist on the map table. "Our Luftwaffe has destroyed their western factories,
Yet the flow of tanks continues. Are we facing some form of miracle? His officers shuffled uneasily, struggling to find words that would not offend his temper. In reality, what the Germans had witnessed was a feat of logistical and industrial genius. By the end of October, over 1,500 factories had been relocated. Production lines, often designed for one continuous process, were carefully disassembled, catalogued, transported, and reassembled in the Urals, Siberia, and even Central Asia. Each relocation was coordinated by the People's Commissariat of Heavy Industry, with railway directors, engineers, and military liaisons working in tandem. In the industrial town of Nizhny Tagil, workers labored under strict military oversight to assemble the first batches of T-34s and KV-1 tanks. The machinery, some of it still covered in soot from Western factories, was reinstalled with precision. Chief Engineer Mikhail Petrovich moved from line to line, inspecting welds, checking alignment, and ensuring that production could ramp up quickly. Every mistake now, he told his team, will cost lives at the front. German reconnaissance reports failed to anticipate the scale or efficiency of these new operations. Luftwaffe pilots scouted the Urals, dropping small bombs in an attempt to disrupt assembly lines. But the factories were dispersed, fortified, and camouflaged in dense forests. Smokestacks mimicked trees, and temporary rail yards were shielded from aerial observation. The Soviets had learned from the devastation of Western cities. Hiding and decentralizing production was as much a weapon as a tank or a gun. Back in Berlin, the general's disbelief grew daily. It's as if the Soviet Union has multiple hearts, muttered Field Marshal von Bock, rubbing his temples. Destroy one, and another begins to beat stronger than before. Reports of entire divisions being supplied with new equipment, despite Western cities being under German occupation, seemed almost fantastical. Intelligence officers coined it a war of shadows. The Soviets' factories existed everywhere, and nowhere at once. Yet for all the German frustration, Stalin remained calm, almost stoically confident. In the Kremlin, he reviewed the new production schedules, maps and rail timetables. Every tank produced, every shell fired, was a testament to careful planning and unyielding will. They think they have destroyed us, he remarked quietly to his aide, but we are already moving forward. By the winter of 1941, Hitler's generals had reached a grim conclusion. The Soviet Union's industrial heart could not be broken by conventional means. They had assumed victory would come with the capture of Moscow and Leningrad, but the new factories east of the Urals meant that production and resistance would continue. The German assumption that a blitz through the Western Soviet Union would collapse the Red Army had been fatally flawed. The operational miracle of relocating Soviet industry would prove decisive. While the Wehrmacht struggled with overextended supply lines and harsh winter conditions, the Soviets, fed by newly reassembled factories, were readying to strike. Banks, artillery, and aircraft rolled off assembly lines in remote eastern cities, invisible to the German high command, yet poised to alter the course of the war.
Section 4. Life in the shadow of the Urals. Soldiers and workers unite. November 1941. The snow had begun to blanket the Ural Mountains in a thick, unforgiving layer. Bitter winds cut across the makeshift factories and temporary barracks, yet inside, the air was alive with the sound of industry. Hammering, welding, and the roar of engines filled the cavernous halls. The relocated factories had become small cities of steel and determination, where soldiers, engineers, and civilians worked side by side in a shared mission to keep the Soviet war machine alive. Lieutenant Ivan Petrovich, now reassigned to the Urals to oversee production quality,
walked among the workers with a keen eye. He paused at an assembly line, watching a group of machinists carefully fit turret rings onto T-34 hulls. "Precision, comrades," he instructed firmly. "These tanks will face the German advance. Every bolt counts." A young apprentice glanced nervously at the lieutenant, then nodded, tightening a rivet with steady hands. The sense of urgency was palpable. Every finished tank meant more resistance at the front. In nearby barracks, soldiers performed double duty. When not sent to guard rail yards or supply depots, they joined the engineers on the factory floor, learning to operate presses, lathe machines, and welding torches. Sergeant Nikolai Orlov, a former tank commander, had become an instructor overnight, teaching infantrymen how to assemble transmissions and gun turrets. "If you can't fire it," he joked grimly, "you better learn to build it." Despite the harsh conditions, morale was surprisingly high. A sense of purpose unified everyone under one common goal: survival and defiance against an enemy that seemed unstoppable in the West. Outside, the harsh winter made logistics a constant struggle. Rail lines iced over, locomotives groaned under extreme loads, and snowdrifts threatened to immobilize entire convoys. Yet engineers and soldiers improvised. Tracks were heated with fires, makeshift snowplows cleared critical routes, and teams of laborers worked around the clock to ensure shipments of raw materials arrived on schedule. Nothing could halt the flow of production. Meanwhile, German reconnaissance continued to struggle. Pilots flying over the Ural plains saw only sparse settlements, dense forests, and the faint glimmer of chimneys rising above treetops. Reports filtered back that production had resumed in some areas, but the scale remained unclear. For Hitler's generals, every piece of intelligence seemed contradictory. Destroyed Western factories, yet new tanks and weapons appearing on the battlefield. Their assumptions about Soviet collapse had been shattered. Inside the factories, innovation flourished. Engineers adapted equipment to local resources, improvising solutions to problems that Western blueprints never anticipated. Coal-powered furnaces replaced lost electric systems, local steel was repurposed for tank armor, and assembly lines were modified to maximize output despite limited space. The sheer ingenuity of the workforce turned adversity into an advantage. Every machine that rolled off the line represented not just industrial skill, but human resilience. Amid the cold and noise, life persisted. Families who had followed their relocated factories set up temporary schools, shared meals in communal kitchens, and supported each other through the long nights. Children carried tools and messages across sprawling workyards, witnessing firsthand the scale of the Soviet wartime effort. Soldiers became mentors, engineers became comrades, and the factories themselves became symbols of survival. As December approached, the first fully assembled tanks began to leave their protective Ural shelters, ready to be transported back toward the front. T-34s gleamed under the dim winter sun, their engines rumbling with life after weeks of painstaking assembly. Officers inspected them carefully, ensuring that each was fully operational. "These machines," remarked Captain Mikhailov, watching the tanks roll past, "are our answer to the Germans. They thought they had won, but here in the cold and snow we are ready to fight back." Unseen by the Wehrmacht, a new Soviet industrial network had emerged, resilient, mobile, and fortified against the German blitz. While Hitler's generals continued to chase shadows in the West, the East was quietly arming a nation, preparing for the counteroffensive that would ultimately turn the tide of the war.
Section 5. The first fruits of labor. Tanks and weapons returned to the front. January 1942. The snow had hardened into thick, crusted layers across the Ural plains, turning every step into a deliberate effort. Yet the relentless hum of industry never ceased. The relocated factories, now fully operational, produced a steady stream of T-34 tanks, KV-1s, artillery pieces, and small arms, each carefully tested and inspected before deployment. Every crate packed, every vehicle rolled out, carried a weight far beyond its metal frame. It was a symbol of Soviet endurance and ingenuity. At a rail depot near Chelyabinsk, Major General Dmitry Medvedev oversaw the loading of the first massive convoy bound for the front. Snowplows cleared tracks in record time, and soldiers secured the tank transporters with meticulous care. Each rail car must arrive intact, he instructed. The Germans cannot intercept what they cannot see, and we will ensure it stays that way. He nodded to Lieutenant Petrovich, who had returned to supervise quality control. Our labor is ready to prove itself in battle, Medvedev said, his breath visible in the icy air. Meanwhile, reconnaissance reports filtering back to German intelligence painted an impossible picture. Units advancing into previously captured territories began encountering fresh Soviet armor and artillery, far more than expected. Colonel Wilhelm Richter read the reports again, disbelief etched across his face. Entire battalions were equipped with new tanks that had emerged from seemingly nowhere. They are producing faster than we can destroy, he admitted quietly to his peers. Our assumptions were wrong. Entire factories gone and reassembled beyond our reach. At the front, Red Army commanders were stunned by the sudden arrival of reinforcements. Major Alexei Ivanov, stationed near Moscow, watched as a convoy of T-34s rumbled into position. The tanks gleamed even under the gray winter sky, their engines growling like a living force ready to strike. Soldiers lined up to inspect the new armor and weaponry. Finally, whispered one private, rubbing his frostbitten hands, finally we can fight back. The Germans, by contrast, faced mounting frustration. Hitler's generals had expected Soviet production to collapse after the fall of the Western industrial heartlands, yet here it was, reborn in the East and already reshaping the battlefield. Guderian, once confident of a quick victory, found his plans delayed and disrupted by an unexpected enemy, not just the Red Army, but an industrial miracle operating hundreds of kilometers behind the front lines. Back in the Urals, the factories continued their ceaseless operation. Engineers innovated to maximize output under wartime conditions. Pressed steel panels were reinforced with local alloys, ammunition production was streamlined for speed, and assembly lines ran around the clock, sometimes with 3 shifts working through the frozen nights. Chief Engineer Mikhail Petrovich inspected a newly completed tank, nodding with approval. "This is no mere machine," he said to his team. "This is our answer to the invaders. Every weld, every bolt, every rivet is a strike against them." In small workshops scattered across the region, even seemingly minor parts were being manufactured with precision. Gearboxes, gun barrels, and suspension components were tested rigorously, ensuring that the tanks arriving at the front would perform flawlessly in battle. Soldiers, engineers, and civilians worked side by side, united by a common purpose. Even the harsh winter, which had once seemed an enemy, became a partner, preserving metal, allowing quieter movement, and keeping operations hidden from German reconnaissance. By late winter, a pattern emerged on the battlefield. Wherever German forces expected Soviet defenses to crumble, they instead faced a growing, replenished resistance. New tanks rolled off eastward lines and reached frontline units with astonishing speed. German soldiers, accustomed to rapid advances, were shocked by the renewed strength and tenacity of the Red Army. Reports filtered back to Berlin that challenged every preconception. The Soviets had moved, rebuilt, and returned stronger than ever, and so the industrial miracle of the Urals began to translate into tangible battlefield advantage. The factories, once in danger of destruction, had become the engine of Soviet resurgence. The Germans had underestimated not only the resilience of the Soviet people, but also their ability to turn retreat into strategic opportunity. Every tank that rumbled onto the icy roads from the east carried with it the weight of an entire nation's defiance.
Section 6. A nation mobilized. Civilian effort. Behind the Iron Curtain. February 1942. Beyond the Urals. In towns hastily transformed into industrial fortresses, life had taken on a relentless rhythm. Factories hummed day and night, but the war effort extended far beyond machinery. Civilians, teachers, bakers, and engineers alike became integral to the production of weapons and the sustenance of the relocated workforce. No role was too small. Every action mattered in the delicate ecosystem of wartime industry. In Magnitogorsk, a city now swollen with displaced workers and their families, women labored alongside men in assembly halls, welding tank tracks and assembling artillery components. Young girls delivered tools to the factory floor, while older women cooked in massive canteens to feed hundreds at a time. "Keep moving," shouted Svetlana Morozova, a forewoman overseeing a welding crew. The front depends on us. Each tank, each shell is a life saved. Her voice rose above the roar of machinery, carrying both authority and hope. Rail yards, which had once been quiet rural stations, were now bustling hubs of movement. Soldiers and civilians worked side by side, unloading raw materials, transferring engines and inspecting crates bound for the front. Engineers devised ingenious solutions to logistical challenges. Makeshift cranes lifted multi-ton machinery, and improvised hoists enabled swift installation of heavy components on assembly lines. Every day was a race against time, the stakes measured in both lives and kilometers of advancing German forces. Even children played a part in this colossal effort. In small groups, they carried messages and components between workshops, learned the names of tools and parts, and absorbed the culture of resilience around them. In the evenings, when snowstorms raged outside, they gathered in communal shelters for lessons and storytelling, their laughter a quiet reminder of the world they were fighting to preserve. Meanwhile, Soviet officers worked tirelessly to coordinate the vast workforce. Major General Dmitry Medvedev traveled between factories and rail yards, inspecting production lines and ensuring that standards remained high. "We are not merely producing tanks," he told an assembly crew. "We are building the future of our nation. Every part you assemble, every machine you repair, is a strike against the enemy." His presence inspired confidence. Even in the harshest winter, morale remained remarkably strong. German intelligence struggled to comprehend this mobilization. Reports from reconnaissance flights indicated activity, but the true scale remained elusive. Colonel Richter, reviewing aerial photos, noted the sprawling industrial complexes hidden by forests and snowdrifts. "It is beyond anything we have encountered," he wrote. "Factories vanish from the west and reappear hundreds of kilometers to the east, operating at full capacity. Their resilience defies logic. Hitler's generals could only shake their heads. Their blitzkrieg, designed to cripple the Soviet war machine, had instead spurred an unprecedented industrial migration and civilian mobilization. Even in the depths of winter, innovation flourished. Engineers adapted to limited resources, modifying equipment to work with local materials, and improvising solutions to maintain uninterrupted production. Boilers were converted to burn local coal, furnaces were optimized for speed, and assembly lines were reconfigured for maximum efficiency. Every improvement, no matter how small, amplified the scale of output, and ensured that the Red Army would be resupplied with weapons and vehicles essential for survival. By the end of February, the first convoys of tanks and artillery had been deployed from these eastern factories to reinforce critical positions along the front. Soviet soldiers, once demoralized by retreat and loss, now welcomed the new arrivals with renewed vigor. Major Alexei Ivanov, inspecting his unit's new T-34s, noted with satisfaction that the tanks were superior to those previously in service, featuring improved armor and reliability. "They thought we were finished," he said quietly. "But here, in the East, we have risen again." The efforts of civilians and soldiers alike had created an industrial network, capable of sustaining the war indefinitely. The Germans, still advancing through Western territories, had no idea that the Soviet Union's capacity to resist was growing daily, nurtured by the sweat, skill, and sacrifice of a nation that refused to surrender.
Section 7. Turning the Tide. The Soviets Strike Back. March 1942. The bitter Ural winter began to yield to the first hints of spring, but the front lines remained frozen in stalemate. Yet far to the east, an unprecedented surge of Soviet production had begun to change the balance of power. Convoys of freshly built T-34 tanks and artillery rolled steadily toward Moscow, Leningrad, and key southern fronts, reinforcing units that had been battered by months of German onslaught. Colonel Alexei Petrov, commanding a mechanized brigade outside Moscow, watched as the first trains of the newly assembled T-34s rumbled into position. "It is more than we expected," he remarked, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. "Our enemies assumed we were finished. But look at this. Hundreds of tanks ready to fight, hundreds more to come. The roar of engines echoed across the plains, a tangible reminder that the Soviet war machine had not been destroyed. It had simply relocated, regrouped, and returned stronger than before. At the same time, German forces, emboldened by initial victories, pushed deeper into Soviet territory, only to encounter an unexpected challenge. Freshly supplied, highly mobile Soviet armor, the T-34, with its sloped armor and superior mobility, shocked German panzer divisions, accustomed to outdated intelligence on Soviet capabilities. Units that had planned rapid encirclements suddenly found themselves facing resilient defenses, reinforced by machines that had materialized almost from nowhere. Hitler's generals were increasingly frustrated. Intelligence reports, once dismissed as exaggeration, confirmed the unthinkable. Industrial complexes had been moved beyond the reach of the Wehrmacht, reconstructed, and were already feeding the front with new tanks, artillery, and munition. Field Marshal von Bock muttered bitterly during a staff meeting, "Their factories vanished from our maps, yet their weapons appear where we least expect them. How can a nation recover so quickly?" Meanwhile, in the Ural factories, the sense of purpose intensified. Chief Engineer Mikhail Petrovich oversaw the construction of another batch of KV-1 heavy tanks, each engine tested, each turret aligned. Workers moved with disciplined precision, aware that the machines they were building would face some of the fiercest battles of the war. Women carried components across factory floors, soldiers assisted in welding and assembly, and children helped deliver messages and small parts, all united in a single mission, to ensure the survival and victory of their nation. As spring progressed, the first major Soviet counteroffensives began. T-34 brigades, supplied by eastern factories, struck at overstretched German lines near Moscow. Soldiers reported seeing machines they had never encountered before, tanks that combined speed, armor, and firepower in ways that German intelligence had underestimated. The psychological impact was profound. Units that had anticipated an easy advance suddenly faced fierce resistance and mechanized counterattacks. In Berlin, Hitler's generals convened emergency meetings. Maps were spread across tables, aerial photographs scrutinized, and reports read aloud. Yet no solution emerged. The Soviet industrial relocation had nullified one of the Wehrmacht's core assumptions, that crippling Western factories would end resistance. Instead, the Germans now faced a rejuvenated enemy, resupplied and reorganized, striking back with force and coordination that defied their expectation. Even at the front, soldiers began to recognize the magnitude of the industrial miracle. Private Ivan Sedorov, seeing a newly arrived T-34 rumble past his position, whispered to his comrade, "They told us we had nothing left, but they've rebuilt everything. They've made more tanks than we can count." The sentiment was widespread. Where despair had once reigned, hope now flourished, fueled by the relentless output of eastern factories and the determination of a nation under siege. By mid-1942, the effect was undeniable. Soviet counteroffensives, powered by the products of the Urals and Siberia, stabilized key sectors of the front and inflicted unexpected losses on the German. The Wehrmacht, previously confident in its path to victory, now faced a resilient adversary, capable of absorbing blows and striking back with renewed strength. The relocation of industry had not only preserved the Soviet war machine, it had shifted the momentum of the conflict, laying the foundation for the eventual push westward that would redefine the war. Section 8. The Industrial Miracle Revealed. German Shock and Awe. April 1942. The German High Command received reports that defied logic. Entire Soviet armies, previously assumed to be understrength, were now equipped with new tanks, artillery, and ammunition. As if replenished by a hidden hand, Hitler's generals gathered in tense meetings, Flipping through reconnaissance photographs of sprawling factory complexes in the Urals and Siberia, smoke rose from chimneys, surrounded by dense forests. Train yards stretched for miles, loaded with armored vehicles and munitions. Field Marshal von Kluge stared at the maps in disbelief. "They have moved entire industries," he muttered, voice low, almost fearful. "Factories we destroyed in the west are alive again, hundreds, no thousands of kilometers to the east." His aide, Colonel Richter, nodded grimly. "It is not merely survival," he said. "It is an industrial miracle. They are producing faster than we can destroy. Every tank, every shell. It comes from beyond our reach." Even seasoned officers struggled to comprehend the scale. German intelligence, accustomed to the predictable patterns of war, had failed to account for the logistical genius of the Soviets. Stalin's relocation of over 1,500 factories was unprecedented in modern warfare. Entire production lines had been uprooted, transported over thousands of kilometers by rail, and reassembled in remote regions, all under wartime conditions, with the front collapsing in the west. Inside the Ural factories, the scale of the effort was staggering. In Nizhny Tagil, the Tankograd complex produced hundreds of T-34s monthly. In Chelyabinsk, heavy artillery and KV-1 tanks rolled off newly installed assembly line. Engineers like Mikhail Petrovich supervised a workforce that numbered in the tens of thousands, ensuring every machine met strict standards. Soldiers assisted in moving heavy components. Women ran welding stations and managed supply chains. Even children played small but essential roles, ferrying parts or maintaining communications. Meanwhile, trains carried the products of this immense effort back to the front. Locomotives groaned under the weight of armored vehicles, ammunition crates and fuel barrels, weaving through snow-covered forests and mountainous terrain. Every mile was a triumph of planning and perseverance. Soviet commanders awaited these deliveries with a mixture of awe and relief. For units previously depleted, the arrival of fresh tanks and artillery transformed morale and combat effectiveness overnight. Back in Berlin, reports of Soviet armor appearing on the front lines provoked frustration and panic. Guderian, once confident of rapid victory, realized that assumptions about Soviet collapse were entirely false. "We thought we were destroying their capacity," he said bitterly. "Yet here it is, stronger than before. They are fighting with machines we believed lost forever." Hitler's generals struggled to find solutions. Air raids on Western factories had failed. The Eastern complexes were beyond range and heavily camouflaged. Conventional strategies were ineffective against an enemy whose industrial base had literally vanished and reappeared. The psychological impact on the Wehrmacht was profound. German soldiers, accustomed to rapid advances and overwhelmed defenses, now faced a rejuvenated enemy with superior armor and firepower. Units expecting retreating Soviets instead encountered tanks and artillery, freshly supplied from the Urals, as if conjured out of thin air. Morale among German troops wavered, while confidence in command decisions diminished. In the east, the factories continued their relentless output. Engineers improvised with local resources, creating efficient production methods under the harshest conditions. Assembly lines ran day and night, producing a continuous stream of tanks, guns, and ammunition. Every worker understood that the machines they built were not merely instruments of war. They were lifelines for the nation, symbols of defiance against an enemy that assumed Soviet collapse was inevitable. By mid-1942, the full extent of the Soviet industrial miracle became apparent. German commanders could no longer dismiss reports as rumor or exaggeration. The Soviets had not just survived, they had transformed retreat into strategic opportunity, creating a production system that would sustain the war effort for years to come. Hitler's generals, once confident in victory, now confronted the unsettling reality that their enemy's industrial heart had simply moved, rebuilt, and was preparing to strike back with devastating force. Section 9. The counteroffensive begins. From the Urals to the front. May 1942. The snow of the Urals had largely melted, replaced by muddy tracks and the vibrant hum of industry. The factories, once scattered across Western Soviet cities, now pulsed with life hundreds of kilometers from the front lines. Convoys of tanks, artillery, and trucks rolled steadily toward Moscow, Leningrad, and southern fronts, each carrying the fruits of months of painstaking labor. Colonel Alexei Petrov, stationed near Moscow, watched the first wave of T-34s arrive. "They are better than the old models," he remarked to his aide. "Faster, stronger, and more reliable. This changes everything." Soldiers lined up beside the tanks, inspecting engines, checking turrets, and preparing for redeployment. Morale, previously low from relentless German pressure, soared. The arrival of these machines was more than equipment. It was proof that their nation had not been broken, only temporarily displaced. The German army, meanwhile, was increasingly unnerved. Intelligence reports confirmed that Soviet industry was not merely functional, but expanding. Entire brigades, equipped with newly produced T-34s and KV-1s, were appearing on sectors of the front, where the Wehrmacht expected easy resistance. Units that had anticipated surrender instead faced coordinated counterattacks, with armor and artillery arriving faster than anticipated. Hitler's generals struggled to adapt. Colonel Wilhelm Richter, reviewing the latest battlefield reports, admitted quietly, "We underestimated them. Their factories have moved, and they are producing at a rate we cannot match or destroy. Our advance will be slowed, and our losses will increase." In Berlin, the mood was tense. The confidence that had carried the Wehrmacht across Europe was faltering in the face of a Soviet response that seemed almost supernatural in its speed and efficiency. In the Ural factories, life continued with relentless intensity. Engineers like Mikhail Petrovich oversaw new lines of production, refining the assembly of T-34s, KV-1s, and artillery pieces. Soldiers assisted with heavy lifting and logistics, while women and children maintained supply chains, carried parts, and ensured the assembly lines ran without interruption. Every completed tank and cannon was quickly loaded onto rail cars and dispatched eastward, turning the previously defensive effort into a powerful offensive capability. By June, the first major Soviet counteroffensive, supplied entirely by relocated factories, began to take shape. Mechanized brigades, reinforced by freshly produced T-34s, struck German positions outside Moscow. Artillery units, resupplied from eastern depots, pounded enemy fortifications. The Wehrmacht, expecting retreating, exhausted forces, now faced a rejuvenated army with the firepower to challenge their advance. At the front, soldiers experienced firsthand the impact of the industrial miracle. Private Ivan Sidorov, seeing a column of newly arrived tanks, whispered to his comrade, "They told us we were finished. But look at this. They've built them while we were retreating." His words echoed across many units. The Soviets were no longer merely defending. They were actively reclaiming territory. Meanwhile, German commanders faced logistical challenges of their own. Supply lines stretched thin across devastated terrain, and the sudden resurgence of Soviet forces strained their operational planning. Every assault met with unexpectedly strong resistance. Every town thought to be occupied and pacified now required extended engagement. The relocation of Soviet industry had turned the tide of the war not with a single decisive battle, but through a sustained strategic replenishment of equipment and manpower. By midsummer 1942, the Wehrmacht's advance had slowed significantly. Soviet counterattacks, powered by eastern factories, had stabilized key sectors and inflicted unprecedented losses. The German assumption that the Soviet industrial heart could be destroyed had been shattered. Instead, the Red Army now possessed an operational resilience, born from the miracle of industrial relocation, that would carry the nation through some of the darkest months of the war. Section 10. The Legacy of the Urals, an industrial miracle that defied Hitler. July 1942. In the shadow of the Ural Mountains, the relocated factories had transformed into sprawling hubs of industry, hidden from German reconnaissance, yet producing at a scale that astonished even the most seasoned Soviet planners. T-34 tanks rolled off assembly lines in unbroken streams. Artillery pieces thundered onto rail cars, and trucks loaded with ammunition and fuel rumbled toward the front lines. The effort was a symphony of coordination, resilience, and ingenuity that had no parallel in modern warfare. Lieutenant Ivan Petrovich walked through one of the largest assembly halls, his boots echoing on steel floors. Sparks flew from welding torches, and the rhythmic pounding of presses filled the air. Soldiers, engineers, and civilians worked together seamlessly, bound by a single understanding: the survival of their nation depended on their labor. Each machine you build, he told a group of young welders, carries the hope of millions. Remember, back in Berlin, reports of Soviet production continued to baffle Hitler's generals. Colonel Wilhelm Richter compiled intelligence showing that entire armies were now equipped with tanks, artillery, and ammunition originating from factories previously thought lost forever. They have moved, rebuilt, and are producing faster than we can destroy, he wrote. It is not just resilience, it is a miracle. For the first time, the Wehrmacht faced an enemy whose strength was not solely in men or terrain, but in the indomitable ability to recover and reproduce, outpacing even the most sophisticated German planning. The impact of this industrial feat was felt across every front. Soviet counteroffensives, supplied entirely from the east, had stabilized Moscow, relieved pressure on Leningrad, and begun to reclaim territory in the south. Soldiers in these campaigns marveled at the sheer scale of production that had made their efforts possible. Major Alexei Ivanov, overseeing a mechanized brigade, watched T-34s rumble across muddy roads, and remarked, "They thought they could crush us by destroying our factories, but they were wrong. Our industry has outlived their expectations, and now it fights alongside us." Even the workers in the Urals, far from the front, understood the magnitude of their contribution. Women welded, men assembled, and children carried messages, knowing that each part, completed, could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Engineers adapted to shortages, improvised repairs, and optimized production lines, turning adversity into advantage. The harsh winters, long distances, and constant pressure only strengthened their resolve. Every tank, every gun, every shell was a testament to human ingenuity and collective will. By late summer, the German command had to acknowledge a new reality. The Soviet Union could not be broken by conventional means alone. The relocation of factories beyond the Urals had ensured a continuous flow of weapons and equipment, allowing the Red Army not only to survive, but to grow stronger. Hitler's generals, once confident in rapid victory, now faced an enemy whose industrial heart had simply moved, rebuilt, and begun to strike back with devastating effect. The legacy of this monumental effort endured far beyond the war. The Urals had proven that a nation's capacity to resist is not measured solely by territory or initial losses, but by its ability to adapt, innovate, and mobilize its people. Stalin's decision to relocate industry saved the Soviet Union at its darkest hour, preserving the machinery of war and the spirit of a nation determined not to fall. As T-34s and KV-1s rumbled off the assembly lines toward the front, Lieutenant Ivan Petrovich paused to watch, a rare smile breaking through his fatigue. He understood what the Germans could not. The true strength of the Soviet Union lay not just in men or tanks, but in the resilience of a people united in purpose. The factories of the Urals were more than buildings. They were symbols of defiance, innovation, and survival, and they had ensured that the Soviet Union would endure and eventually triumph,
against even the most formidable foe.